Hello and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. So a quick word about these videos. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records, and this could honestly apply to anyone. You may be a student that's looking to undertake the Archivist and Records Management course. You may be a librarian that's been asked to work with some archives. You might be a digitisation manager who wants to know more about the collections and the material they're digitising, or you may just have a general interest in archives and records. This is a topic which I think will intersect with many industries, and the idea of these videos is to be as open and as usable for as many people as possible. The vast majority of videos in this channel will be less than 15 minutes, but some of them will get more complex in certain parts. Sources and further reading will always be posted at the end of the video. And also, I would just like to add, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the comments below. Or if you have any requests, if there's any topics you would like me to make another short video about, please also feel more than free to mention them. I'd be delighted to learn. A quick word about me. I'm an archivist based in London. You can look at my LinkedIn profile here. And lastly, I apologise for my thick accent. I realise if you're not Scottish, you might be struggling a little bit to understand me. Therefore, there'll be a full transcript posted in the description at the end of each video. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the channel and you find this of use. Also, if you find these videos useful, I would be really grateful if you could like and subscribe and possibly hit the bell button as well. Thanks. Okay, so archival descriptions and standards. Archival descriptions and standards are essential to the archival process. Standards allow us to quite effectively standardise the information we collect and also how we enter that information. If you're curious as to why standards are important, consider how you may describe the papers you see here. This would be an archivist's nightmare, incidentally. What information would you record and how would you record it? So, for example, some people may record the title of each bit of paper, where other people might feel that it's important to record the colour of each bit of paper. And also the titles they use for the same type of information might differ. What one person calls as a title, someone else might call name or heading if they're copying it directly from the sheet. So the idea of standards is that it helps to find commonly used terms and information to record, so that two archivists describing the same collection will at least be using the same sort of fields and the same sort of information, and that you can maybe get some sort of crossover from that. The most significant standard is ISAG, which stands for International Standard for Archival Description General. This is an international standard, which means it's used outside of the UK. ISAG established 26 fields separated into 7 distinct areas. And this is a full list of the ISAG elements. So for example, at the very top, you've got a reference code. This comes under identity statement area. That would be like the reference code you see in a cataloging reference. You've also got other things as well, like the name of the creator or the immediate source of acquisition or transfer. So these are sort of 26 fields that ISAG recommends you could capture. However, only 6 fields are mandatory at collection level. So if you watch my previous video, you'll know collection level is the highest level, and that sort of describes the collection overall. These are title, level, dates, extent, creator, and reference. Have I missed one out there? So title, level, dates, creator, extent, and reference. Yeah. However, that said, you will notice that most catalogues also have an administrative and biographical history. They'll also tend to have a scope and content, conditions and access, a language note, and they'll usually have some sort of tags or accession points. So these 6 mandatory fields are often collected, but what you will find is that other fields tend to be used too. Below collection level, only title and reference code are mandatory, but I would personally say that restricted items should also be noted. That usually comes under conditions of access or something like that. ISAG also has 4 principles. These are that descriptions begin at the general information and then goes into more specific information. So for example, at the higher levels of your catalogue, such as collection level, the information there should be much more general than the information you record at file level, which is far more specific. Any information provided should correspond to the level of description. You describe files at file level. For example, you describe series at series level. Descriptions should be linked between levels, which this means, and again, if you watch my other video about archival catalogues and I showed you the idea of the tree, is that you should be able to see how the different components relate. So if a file is a child of a subseries or a series, you should be able to link that relationship in some way. And also, you really want to avoid repetitions of information in the descriptions. You don't want to be using the same information too many times at different levels. Otherwise, in some cases, it would defeat the purpose of creating that new description. It's also worth pointing out that scope and content is a very commonly used field in ISAG. It's not technically mandatory, but I think it gets used so much that it is worth going over. And essentially, the scope and content gives a summary of the scope, such as the time, period, or geography, and content. And this might be the documentary forms, subject matter, or administrative process. There's an example here that I took. That's an example, I think, a very good example of a scope and content, and it maybe gives you an idea of what sort of information you'll get from it. The funny thing about scope and contents is that you'll read some scope and contents that are like maybe, 2 or 3 sentences long, and then you'll get other ones that become mini essays. It really varies. Personally, I was always trying to keep it as simple as possible, but it really does vary by collection. Okay, another very common field is administrative and biographical history, and this provides information about the creator or creators of the information you're cataloguing. And again, there's a description below, an example below of an administrative biographical history of Dwight P. Griswold. So yeah, you can look at that for an example. And to be honest with you, if you look at various collections on Archives Hub or the National Archives Discovery, you'll see several examples of this. Another important field is the arrangement note, and this provides information on the internal structure or order of the collection or the system of classification that you're using. A really good way to sort of describe this is if you think of scope and content as describing what the individual parts are, the arrangement notice describes the relationship between these parts. So an example I've given here is the original order of the fonts has been maintained and arranged into 5 series, which reflects the major activities of the creator over the years. So in that example, the person is indicating how they've arranged this collection. And that can be really important, especially if you're deviating from original order, which ideally you don't want to do. Another standard worth talking about here is called NCA Rules. NCA Rules stands for National Convention on Archives, and they defined a set of rules for naming people, places, and organisations. They include rules for what to do when naming someone who was previously married and maybe changed their name, has a title, or has a nickname. This standard is useful as it reduces the chances that archivists will create access points for the same person, but refer to them in a totally different way, albeit this can still happen. So for example, imagine you were dealing with a set of Beatles archives. You have one archivist that refers to Ringo Starr as Ringo Starr, and another archivist refers to him as Richard Starkey. For a researcher, that can be quite confusing. So the idea of NCA Rules is it tries to reduce the chances of this happening. It's not perfect, like you'll still see sort of variations. For example, you'll notice at the end of each one there's a sort of qualifier. So for example, Anne Elizabeth Alice Louise, born 1950, the qualifier is Princess Royal. Sometimes people can use different terminologies there, but the main idea is that NCA Rules does give you some sort of standard to go by. There's also the National Discovery Register, which I would always recommend checking before creating a new description, and Archives Hub. Sometimes if you're naming someone in a collection, especially at collection level, it can be useful to see if they've appeared in other collections before, and if so, how were they described. That's a really good way to try and ensure consistency with other archivists and archives. Generally, there are also a few other standards worth considering, So for example, there's ISAR CPF, that's really good for authority records. I have seen one or two positions where that's a mandatory standard that you need to know about. The UCAT thesaurus, that's another really good one for standardising terms and access points in archival collections. So for example, I think they give guidance on what sort of words you can use. For example, instead of using newspaper cuttings, it might recommend that you use clippings. That's quite useful. EAD, that's encoded archival description, and that comes in an XML format, and that's used for marking up languages. I'm actually thinking of doing a separate video about that because it's very difficult to explain in sort of one bullet point, but that's really interesting. If you go into Archives Hub or you look at some catalogues online, you can sometimes export them as EAD records, and that will give a much clearer idea of what that is. Dublin Core, that's a standard for digital preservation, so that's really good for describing digital information. I think it has 15 core elements, although it's been expanded, and that's often considered one of the core standards for digital preservation. There's another one as well, so that's preservation metadata. Premise again is for digital records, and it gives you a sort of idea of not only how to describe digital objects, but to describe what happens to them, such as the events that a digital item might go through from ingest to cataloguing to being published online. And the thing about this, these standards make a lot more sense once you see them in practice. And there's one other standard that I'm just going to mention briefly, and that's records in context. That's still being developed. It's, I think it's still going through some testing phases at the time of writing. But the idea of that standard is it will help archivists better contextualize the collections they work with. Okay, so at the very end, I've given you a few references here if you want to follow up on this. One link I really recommend is the one at the bottom. This will take you to an ARA page, which offers you a long list of standards and protocols that have been used and gives you an idea of what they're used for. I honestly think that if you want to take this further, sometimes the best way to sort of learn a standard is just try to implement it. And you don't even necessarily need to do it on an archival collection. If you're a student or you're new to archives or for whatever reason, maybe just take some of your own records and just try maybe record information about it using one of the standards. Okay, thanks again. And if you find these videos useful, I would be very grateful if you could like and subscribe and possibly hit the bell button as well. I'm hoping to do a lot more of these videos in the coming months and year, and liking, subscribing and hitting the bell button will make it more likely that you'll see updates in your feed.